The year was 1945. The Philippines was a land torn apart by fire and steel, its people caught between the grinding forces of two armies. Across its islands, villages lay in ruins, their roofs burned black, their streets filled with the echo of boots and gunfire. For the Allied soldiers who had been captured years earlier, the war was not fought with rifles or tanks, but with hunger, exhaustion, and the daily struggle to survive captivity. Behind barbed wire and watchtowers, thousands of men endured conditions that stripped them of both strength and hope. Among these prison camps stood Cabanatuan, a name that would later carry both pain and salvation. Inside, over 500 Allied prisoners of war lived in a fragile world of routine and fear. Their bodies were frail, their faces hollow from years of malnutrition and untreated illness. Many could barely lift themselves from the rough bamboo cots that served as their beds. The air was thick with the smell of disease, a reminder that time was running out for men who had already given so much. Every day began the same way. The gates clanged open and guards moved with rigid authority. The prisoners, forced into obedience, shuffled to roll call under the sharp eyes of their captors. For many, it was the only time of day they stood in formation, their once proud bearing reduced to silence and weakness. Yet behind their weary eyes, a stubborn flame of survival still lingered. That flame, small as it was, would soon be fanned by forces beyond the camp. Outside the wire, the tide of war was beginning to change. American and Filipino troops were clawing their way back across the islands, inch by inch. Each village reclaimed was another step toward liberation, another piece of home taken back. For the prisoners at Cabanatuan, the sound of distant artillery was both a promise and a threat. If freedom came too slowly, the Japanese might choose to execute them rather than see them rescued. Their fate, it seemed, balanced on a knife's edge. For the men trapped inside, rumors became their only currency of hope. Whispers passed between cots in the dark of night, tales of advancing armies and daring missions. Some dismissed them as fantasy, a way to ease the pain of another endless day. Others clung to them fiercely, imagining the moment when the gates would finally swing open, not for roll call, but for deliverance. These dreams, fragile as they were, helped sustain them against despair. Life in the camp was a cycle of hunger and exhaustion. The meals were thin gruel, barely enough to keep men alive. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, and diseases spread unchecked. The prisoners' bodies wasted away, their bones sharp beneath skin stretched tight. In the stillness of night, coughing and moaning filled the barracks, reminders that death walked silently among them. Yet each morning, as weak legs carried them back into line, they endured. The prison was a world defined by waiting. Waiting for food, waiting for orders, waiting for freedom that never came. The guards, with their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, seemed to hold complete control. Yet outside the walls, unseen by those inside, events were unfolding that would soon break this pattern forever. The men of Cabanatuan could not have known it, but their long nightmare was nearing its end. This was the setting, a fragile balance between life and death, between captivity and freedom. The camp was not simply a place of confinement. It was a stage upon which one of the most daring rescues of the war would be played. For the prisoners, each day felt like the last. For the world outside, their liberation was already being planned. And soon, history would record how, in a single night, hundreds of lives would be pulled back from the edge of oblivion. Inside Cabanatuan, the difference between captors and captives was stark and unrelenting. Japanese soldiers walked the perimeter with rifles in hand, their boots striking against the hard ground in steady rhythm. Their uniforms were pressed, their posture sharp, their voices commanding authority. In contrast, the prisoners shuffled barefoot or in ragged shoes, their bodies reduced to shadows of their former selves. The line between power and powerlessness could be seen in a single glance, as strong guards loomed over men who could barely stand. The daily routine magnified this imbalance. Guards barked orders, and the prisoners obeyed without resistance. To disobey meant beatings or worse, and so silence became their only defense. The prisoners, once soldiers filled with pride, were now reduced to a routine of survival. Even speaking too loudly risked punishment, while the guards spoke freely, their laughter or anger ringing across the compound. For the men behind the wire, every interaction reminded them of their helplessness. Yet beyond the walls of the camp, another picture was emerging. American forces were returning to the Philippines, landing on beaches and pressing through jungles, determined to retake what had been lost. Filipino guerrillas, armed with whatever weapons they could find, harassed Japanese patrols and gathered intelligence. Together, they represented a force growing in strength and confidence. In sharp contrast to the frailty of the prisoners, these fighters embodied momentum and resistance. The gap between those trapped inside and those advancing outside revealed two very different sides of the same war. The guards sensed the shift as well. Tension grew in their ranks as American forces drew nearer. With every report of enemy advances, their discipline seemed harsher, their punishments more severe. They knew that the war was turning against them, and desperation fueled their cruelty. For the prisoners, this meant life became even more fragile, as each day brought fear not just of starvation or disease, but of sudden execution. The guards held the power, and they seemed ready to use it to erase all trace of those in their care. The difference between life inside and outside the camp could not have been more striking. In the jungles, strength and unity grew with each battle fought. Inside the fences, weakness spread like an infection, leaving men too frail to stand. Yet these two worlds were on a collision course. The prisoners endured their suffering without knowing that freedom was slowly, invisibly, closing in. The clash between captivity and liberation would soon break the iron grip of the camp. This contrast was not only physical, but deeply emotional. Imagine being one of the prisoners, watching guards eat rations while you picked at a bowl of thin rice. Imagine hearing their laughter while your body ached with fever and your spirit fought to stay alive. The guards' confidence was born of authority, while the prisoners' quiet strength was born of survival. It was a battle of willpower fought without weapons, one side believing it controlled the future, the other clinging to hope that the future had not yet been written. Cabanatuan had not always been the camp that history would remember. In the early years of the war, it was established as a holding ground for Allied prisoners captured in the Philippines. At first, it housed thousands, men taken after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. Conditions quickly deteriorated as resources dwindled, and the long years of captivity stripped the camp of any sense of order or humanity. By 1945, fewer than 1,000 remained, but those still alive carried the weight of suffering that seemed endless. Their bodies were frail, their spirits worn thin, and the thought of rescue felt more like a fading dream than a real possibility. The camp became a symbol of despair for both the prisoners and those who knew of its existence. Medical supplies were scarce, food rations even scarcer, and disease spread unchecked. Dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition consumed men who had once been soldiers in their prime. The bamboo huts that served as barracks offered little protection against the harsh elements of the Philippine climate. Heat, rain, and swarms of insects were constant companions, adding to the misery of confinement. The men of Cabanatuan lived in a state of limbo, uncertain whether their captors would keep them alive or end their suffering with a final order. Outside the barbed wire, however, the war was shifting. American forces under General MacArthur had returned to the islands, determined to drive the Japanese out. Each successful landing and each reclaimed village brought them closer to Cabanatuan. Filipino guerrillas who had fought tirelessly since the beginning of the occupation provided intelligence and support. They had watched the camp closely, noting the movement of guards and the daily rhythms inside. It was through their eyes that American planners began to see the outlines of a possible rescue. The danger was immense. The camp was heavily guarded, and any attempt to break in risked immediate massacre. History had already shown that Japanese forces, when pressed, often chose execution over surrender. For the prisoners, this meant that as the Allies advanced, the threat to their lives grew even greater. The closer freedom came, the more likely it was to be snatched away at the last moment. Rescue was not simply an option, It was becoming a necessity. Intelligence officers understood the urgency. Reports indicated that if Japanese forces decided to retreat from the area, they would likely kill every man in the camp. The decision to attempt a rescue was not taken lightly, but the stakes left no alternative. Planners knew they would have only one chance, and it had to succeed. The cost of failure would be the lives of hundreds, perhaps executed in retaliation. Yet, in the midst of uncertainty, the determination to act grew stronger with each passing day. Thus, the origins of one of the most daring missions of the war began to take shape. It was born not from boldness alone, but from desperation and duty. Saving the prisoners was about more than strategy. It was about humanity and honor. For the Americans, it meant proving they did not abandon their own. For the Filipinos, it was a chance to strike a decisive blow against their occupiers. Together, they would plan a rescue that seemed almost impossible, one that would test the limits of courage and precision. The decision to attempt the raid on Cabanatuan was not just about the men behind the barbed wire. It was also about the battlefield itself, where morale could be as powerful as bullets and artillery. Commanders understood that the rescue would ripple across the ranks of Allied troops fighting in the Philippines. If successful, it would prove to every soldier that they were not forgotten, no matter how dire the circumstances. The act of reaching deep into enemy territory to save prisoners would send a message stronger than any speech. It would declare that every man mattered, even those who had long been lost in captivity. In the jungles and villages of the Philippines, this mattered deeply. Many soldiers had lived with the haunting thought of being captured, of enduring the same fate as those who had fallen at Bataan. The stories of starvation, disease, and cruelty at the hands of the Japanese were well known among the ranks. Fear of capture was a shadow that followed every step. To know that their comrades might be freed and not left to die in silence lifted that shadow. It offered a kind of armor for the spirit, as valuable as any helmet or rifle. For the Filipino guerrillas, the rescue carried its own weight. Their fight had been long and bitter, waged with little recognition and with endless risks. By joining in the plan, they were not only helping to free prisoners, they were showing the world that the struggle for the Philippines was one of shared sacrifice. Their knowledge of the terrain, their ability to guide soldiers through the jungle, and their courage in the face of certain danger made them indispensable. The raid was not simply American, it was a joint effort born from partnership and necessity. The battlefield impact also extended to the enemy. The Japanese had maintained their authority in the Philippines partly through fear. The existence of camps like Cabanatuan served as a reminder of what happened to those who resisted. A successful raid would shatter that image. It would show that Japanese control was slipping, that even behind fences and guards, their hold was not absolute. The psychological blow of losing hundreds of prisoners in a single night would strike deeply into enemy ranks. On a broader scale, the raid was designed to demonstrate resolve. The war in the Pacific had been brutal and costly, fought across islands with staggering losses. Each victory was measured in blood, and each defeat carried heavy consequences. The liberation of hundreds of prisoners was not only a tactical success, it was a moral one. It proved that the war was about more than territory. It was about people, about the promise that no one would be abandoned, no matter how desperate the situation. Imagine being a soldier fighting in the Philippines at that time. You hear the news that men once thought doomed have been brought back to safety. The knowledge fills you with pride and renewed strength. Suddenly, the endless march through jungle mud and the danger of ambush feel more bearable. You fight with the certainty that, if captured, you too would not be forgotten. This was the impact the raid was designed to have, and it succeeded in ways no ordinary battle could achieve. The raid on Cabanatuan would not change the course of the war by itself, but its influence on the battlefield was undeniable. It gave soldiers courage, gave guerrillas recognition, and struck at the heart of Japanese authority. The battlefield was not only about guns and numbers, it was about spirit, and the rescue gave that spirit a new fire. For the men who carried it out, and for those who heard of it afterward, the impact was clear. This was a victory of the human will as much as of military strategy. The liberation of Cabanatuan was not confined to the walls of the prison camp. Its impact spread far beyond the barbed wire, touching soldiers, civilians, and even nations. For Allied troops across the Pacific, news of the rescue was electrifying. Men who had marched and fought for years, haunted by the thought of capture, suddenly felt reassured. They knew that should the worst happen, they would not be left to rot in some forgotten camp. The raid became proof of a promise that no soldier would be abandoned, no matter the danger. For the prisoners themselves, the consequences were profound. They returned to the ranks of the living, not only in body but in spirit. Many had nearly lost hope, resigned to a fate of disease or execution, to be carried to safety, to see friendly faces and hear words of freedom, was to be given a second life. Their survival became living testimony to the courage of those who risked everything to save them. In time, their stories would inspire countless others, but in that moment, it was enough simply to breathe free air again. The rescue also carried political weight. The cooperation between American forces and Filipino guerrillas sent a powerful message. It was evidence that the fight for the Philippines was not only an American campaign, but a shared struggle. Filipino fighters, who had waged a quiet and deadly resistance for years, were suddenly recognized as essential allies. Their role in the raid validated their sacrifices and underscored the depth of their commitment. In villages and towns across the islands, the story spread quickly, fueling both pride and determination to push the occupiers out. On the Japanese side, the consequences were devastating. The camp at Cabanatuan had stood as a symbol of their control, a reminder that prisoners were helpless and that Japanese authority was unchallenged. Its sudden loss and the liberation of hundreds of men under their watch was a public humiliation. It signaled that their grip on the Philippines was weakening, that even their guarded compounds were not safe. The shock reverberated through the ranks, shaking confidence and planting seeds of doubt. Beyond the immediate war effort, the raid became a rallying cry. It reminded the world that in the midst of destruction, there were still acts of humanity and bravery that cut through the darkness. Families at home heard the news and wept with relief, not only for their loved ones, but for the proof that courage still carried weight. Newspapers published accounts that framed the raid as one of the war's great victories, not measured in land or ships, but in lives saved. In a conflict defined by staggering losses, this moment of triumph stood apart. Imagine the atmosphere in Allied camps after the news spread. Soldiers gathered around radios or read reports, sharing looks of disbelief and pride. The story lifted them, if only for a while, above the mud and blood of battle. It gave them a glimpse of the humanity that war often buries. For commanders, it reinforced the importance of morale, proving that victories of the heart could be as valuable as those on the map. The wider consequences of Cabanatuan echoed long after the operation itself. It reinforced the bond between nations, struck a blow to enemy confidence, and renewed the strength of those still fighting. It reminded the world that in war, even the smallest group of men could carry out a mission that changed history. The rescue was more than a raid. It was a promise kept, a light in the darkest of times, and a symbol that even amid cruelty and despair, hope could still prevail. The night of the raid arrived cloaked in silence. The jungle was thick with shadows, and every step taken by the U.S. Army Rangers and their Filipino guides felt heavy with the weight of hundreds of lives. The air was damp, the ground soft beneath their boots, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay the camp, guarded and dangerous, its prisoners unaware of what was about to unfold. Each man in the raiding party knew that discovery before the attack would mean disaster. There was no room for error. The Rangers crept closer, their movements timed to avoid detection. Ahead, Filipino guerrillas cut paths through the undergrowth, leading them with certainty born of years of resistance. The sound of insects hummed in the air, masking the rustle of boots in the grass. Hearts beat fast, every sense sharpened to the possibility of gunfire. In the stillness, the camp came into view, its watchtowers silhouetted against the moonlight. Behind those fences lay the men they had come to save, still unaware that freedom was only moments away. When the signal was given, the night erupted. Gunfire cracked through the silence. The sudden burst startling guards who had never imagined such an assault. Rangers surged forward with precision, their training guiding every movement. The guards fell quickly, overwhelmed before they could mount a defense. Barracks doors were flung open, and bewildered prisoners stared in shock as rescuers shouted for them to rise. Confusion gave way to tears and disbelief as the truth sank in. Inside the camp, chaos turned to liberation. Some prisoners staggered forward, their weak legs trembling as they tried to follow their rescuers. Others could not walk at all, and were lifted onto the shoulders of soldiers or dragged gently across the ground. Voices choked with emotion filled the night, mingling with the clash of battle. For men who had lived with the expectation of death, the sudden appearance of freedom was almost too much to grasp. Their nightmare was ending, but the moment was surreal. The escape itself was as dangerous as the raid. Columns of freedmen moved into the darkness, guided by rangers and guerrillas who knew the land. Every sound of distant gunfire threatened to give them away. Every step carried the risk of ambush. The rescuers urged the prisoners forward, whispering encouragement, carrying those who faltered. The jungle became both shield and trial, its thick foliage hiding them but also slowing their pace. Yet forward they went, driven by the urgency of survival. Imagine being one of those prisoners, too weak to stand, suddenly hoisted onto the back of a stranger who carried you as if your life were his own. Imagine the shock of hearing friendly voices after years of cruelty, the feel of the cool night air on your skin outside the fences that had confined you. Fear mingled with hope, exhaustion with exhilaration. Each step into the jungle was a step away from death. Each heartbeat was proof that they were alive and free. By the time dawn approached, more than 500 prisoners had been pulled from the jaws of captivity. The camp that had been their prison was left silent behind them, stripped of its power. In a single night, despair had been overturned by courage. The climax of the story was not just the raid itself, but the impossible reality that it had worked. Against all odds, hundreds of men who had expected death had been given life again. It was a moment that history would remember as one of the greatest rescues of the war. The raid at Cabanatuan did not end with the escape into the jungle. In the days that followed, the survivors were sheltered, fed, and treated by those who had risked everything to bring them out. The frail prisoners who had lived on the edge of death for years began the long process of recovery. For many, the first taste of real food and clean water felt unreal, almost overwhelming. Some wept quietly, others simply sat in silence, unable to fully believe that the nightmare had ended. The weight of captivity had been lifted, but the scars, physical and emotional, remained. For the soldiers who carried out the mission, the raid became a defining moment of their service. They had entered enemy territory with slim odds of success and emerged with hundreds of lives restored. Their courage was celebrated not only in the Philippines, but across the Allied world. Newspapers printed their story as a symbol of bravery and determination. Families who had prayed endlessly for news of their loved ones finally had reason to rejoice. The operation proved that even in a war defined by destruction, there were still moments of triumph built on sacrifice and honor. The legacy of Cabanatuan stretched far beyond the war itself. It became a story told in history books, classrooms, and documentaries, preserved as one of the most daring rescues ever attempted. For Filipinos, it stood as proof of their critical role in the fight for liberation. Their knowledge, courage, and sacrifice had been indispensable, and their partnership with American soldiers demonstrated the strength of unity. For Americans, the raid reaffirmed the promise to protect their own and never abandon them, no matter the cost. In the years that followed, survivors of the raid shared their memories, ensuring that the story would not fade. They spoke of the hunger, the sickness, and the despair, but also of the moment when the gates opened and hope became reality. Their voices kept alive the lessons of courage and resilience. Younger generations learned that history is not only shaped by grand battles and famous leaders, but also by acts of compassion and bravery carried out by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Imagine standing at the site of the camp today, where the ground lies quiet and the watchtowers are long gone. It is difficult to picture the suffering that once filled the air, the cries of men weakened by years of captivity. Yet, in that silence, the memory of the raid lingers. It is not the cruelty of the camp that endures in history, but the courage of those who risked everything to save the helpless. That is the legacy that remains. The rescue of more than 500 prisoners in a single night remains one of World War II's most inspiring chapters. It was not about conquering land or seizing weapons, but about restoring life and hope. The mission showed that even in humanity's darkest hours, acts of light could break through. For the prisoners, it was salvation. For the rescuers, it was honor. For history, it was a reminder that courage and unity can triumph against impossible odds.